In 1847, deep within the sweltering fields of Riverton, Mississippi, a single ledger entry recorded something. A woman 7 feet tall, purchased, restrained, and feared. Her name was Sarah Freeman, though history tried to erase it. What began as a record of property became a record of defiance, and what she did one April night would echo through generations. This is not folklore. These are fragments, ledger entries, burned letters, and whispered songs, pieced together from archives that never meant to be found. Stay with us, as Forgotten Chronicles reconstructs the true story of the giant slave woman who killed her captors with chains. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. Every week, we exhume another silence the world tried to bury. In the summer heat of 1932, a surveyor for the Mississippi Historical Society uncovered the remains of what locals called the Riverton Estate, little more than a rectangle of brick footings and a scatter of iron nails buried beneath cane and thorn. Among the debris he found a locked metal chest, the hinges seized and the surface blistered by rust. Inside, wrapped in a decayed length of linen, was a ledger. Its binding had collapsed. The pages, though water-stained and brittle, were still intact enough to read. The first entries dated from January 1847. Each line recorded a transaction, the purchase or sale of human beings, noted with precision of weight, age, and assigned duty. The handwriting was narrow and controlled. Most entries fit the expected rhythm of plantation commerce, men and women reduced to columns of cost and yield, until one record interrupted the pattern. Female, 7 feet 1 inch, 7 feet 1 in. Age uncertain. Origin, Louisiana. Price, $1,170. The clerk's pen seemed to falter before the final digit, leaving a blot that spread like bruised ink across the margin. Beneath the price appeared a single name, Sarah. No further details were offered. No mention of parentage, complexion, or previous owner. Only 3 supplementary notations followed, each written in a more hurried hand. Temperament, irregular. Strength, excessive. Discipline, under review. The page's stillness did not hide its disturbance. Numbers that were meant to signify value began instead to describe unease. The plantation's arithmetic stumbled. Subsequent pages extended the same cold vocabulary. Labor hours, yields per week, mortality counts. Yet every few lines, her name re-emerged, always paired with comments that broke the composure of bookkeeping, refused compliance. Unaccounted absence, 2 hours. Requires constant supervision. Scholars who later examined the artifacts had remarked that the ink used for her entries differed slightly in tone, heavier iron content, suggesting that the clerk pressed harder, perhaps out of agitation. In the right light, faint indentations were visible beneath the words, where the quill had carved deeper than necessary. One marginal note, nearly erased, read, Observation. Eyes grey, skin unusually dark. Stature causes unease among hands. The plantation system had no language for what she represented. It could only respond by over-recording, as if the act of inscription might impose order on the anomaly it feared. Between March and May 1847, the ledger's tone shifted from routine to strained. Several pages contained only the word incident, written without detail, replacing the usual counts of bushels or rations. A few lines later, another entry. Damage to equipment, source unknown. Then, overseer report pending. No overseer's report survived. Only the terse continuity of commerce resumed afterward. Births, deaths, and sales unrelated to her. By June 1848, the final reference appeared. Unresolved disturbance. 6 men dispatched. Casualties unrecorded. The handwriting was jagged, the ink darker than the rest, as though written with a different pen or in haste. After that, her name vanished entirely from the record. Modern archivists studying the ledger describe its silence as calculated rather than accidental. The absence of explanation functions like redaction. Something had been deliberately removed. One archivist noted that the page numbering skips between 112 and 115, implying 2 sheets excised. The tear marks are clean. In the margin of page 115, a later hand, different ink, looser script, added a single annotation. Entries concerning Sarah to be withheld until further notice, by order. No signature follows, no date. The ledger was closed thereafter, its final entries drifting back into routine inventories of livestock and acreage. Yet even within its monotony, the earlier disturbance leaves a gravitational mark, a hole where explanation should exist. To read the ledger today is to witness bureaucracy protecting itself. Each number, each cost, each clipped phrase about obedience becomes a defense against something that refused to fit into measurement. The plantation's neat arithmetic could quantify height, weight, and value, but not fear. Historians label her the Riverton Giant, though the ledger never used the word. It called her only female 7'1" in age uncertain. In that uncertainty lies the first fracture in the record, and the beginning of what the plantation chose to call incidents. Among the scattered remains of the Riverton archives, a smaller book survived, a personal journal belonging to overseer Nathaniel Cray, dated between April and December of 1847. The cover, bound in rough leather, is warped by humidity. Its ink, still legible in parts, alternates between the steady hand of habit and the erratic scratches of agitation. The entries, at first routine, soon become centered almost exclusively upon one subject, a woman referred to only as the Louisiana Giant. Cray's first notation concerning her appears on April 2nd, 1847, under the heading Work Assessment, New Arrivals. The woman of 7 feet and some inches refuses to kneel during inspection. Eyes kept level, not downward. Response to orders is minimal. Appears mute by choice. No punishment is recorded that day. By April 4th, the tone had changed. Disobedience persists. Corrective measure administered. 30 lashes. Response, none. No sound. Flesh tore as expected. Her blood is darker. Observed afterward standing by the gate, breathing steady. The men avoided her. The ledger entries hinted at disorder. Cray's journal gives it a body. The document is uncomfortably methodical, an overseer measuring submission as one might measure yield. The more he records, the less control he possesses. By April 11th, his observations carry a tremor. Strength is unnatural. Restraints strained during confinement. 2 links fractured, repaired by a blacksmith. She bends tools, claims they were poorly made, though she speaks rarely. Cannot keep her eyes upon the ground. That final sentence is underlined twice. Scholars note that the handwriting in these sections grows uneven, the spacing irregular. Heat stains mar the paper, suggesting the journal was kept in the field rather than the office. Cray begins to write at night, the ink diluted, entries shorter but increasingly personal. April 18th. Hands wisp.
As she moves after lights out. Not seen sleeping. Tracks found near cane fields, large and deep. Maybe fabrication. April 20th. Requested additional men for restraint. Denied by Mr. Freeman. The journal captures a hierarchy that believed discipline could preserve order. Instead, it documents a structure trembling under its own fear. Cray's vocabulary changes from that of command to justification, his authority cracking sentence by sentence. By May, his entries verge on confession. She does not seem to tire. Heat affects her little. Food untouched some days, yet she remains unweakened. No hymns, no supplication. She watches the men as though measuring. At night, noise from the shed, chains striking the wall. I ordered an inspection at dawn, found links split as though wrenched apart. Metal workers deny such force is possible by hand. No explanation follows, only an increasingly anxious sequence of practical notes, reordering of iron stock, procurement of heavier restraints,
shifts in watch rotation. Each record ends with an insistence on procedure, an attempt to restore bureaucratic rhythm to an environment where rhythm has failed. By June, the handwriting shifts again. The words lean forward, cramped and pale. No sound from the shed. When approached, she stands as before, head bent slightly, asked if she understood punishment. No reply. There is no fear in her. A faint ring appears on that page, likely from the base of a lamp, a moment where hand and light shook together. Between June and July, the tone deteriorates. The entries shorten. June 12th. Men refuse to work nights. June 15th. They say she hums, no tune known. June 21st. I have not seen her sleep. The last complete page, dated July 1st, 1847, carries only one line, written in a trembling hand. The woman does not sleep. After that, the journal ceases abruptly. The next pages are blank except for water damage and faint impressions of erased words. Cray's signature appears nowhere beyond that date. His employment record ends the same summer, with an unsigned notice of illness and departure. Archivists speculate that his journal was not intended for others to read. It was likely confiscated during the aftermath of the Riverton disturbances, the same incidents mentioned in the estate ledgers. What remains is the anatomy of a failing system, an overseer recording the decay of control, unaware that his language had already surrendered to what it sought to contain. Later analysis compared the iron chains found near the overseer's quarters to those stored for field punishment. The surviving links, displayed briefly at the Jackson Historical Museum before being removed, showed signs of torsion, not cut, not rusted, but twisted apart as if by mechanical strain. In this journal, authority becomes pathology. The further Cray wrote, the smaller his world became, until it consisted only of one figure standing motionless under the Mississippi sun. He began as a man of the whip and the tally sheet. He ended as a witness to something his vocabulary could not describe. Recovered correspondence and medical memoranda, March to June 1847. Extract. Letter from Dr. Horace Freeman to Dr. Augustus Vellier, New Orleans Medical Society, dated March 12, 1847. The subject, registered as female number 38, Sarah, presents remarkable anatomical proportions. Muscle composition is unusually dense. No observable tremor under repeated exertion. Flesh tone darker than standard among the local stock, possibly of mixed origin. Skeletal length measures precisely 7 feet and 1 in. Estimated weight 276 pounds. There is no precedent for this degree of stability under labor fatigue. The Freeman papers, preserved in partial form within the Riverton archives, show a gradual shift from curiosity to fixation. Each page, written in a physician's deliberate cursive, catalogues the enslaved woman as though she were an artifact rather than a living being. Dr. Freeman's first notes focus on measurement, calves, wrists, chest circumference. Later entries begin to mention resistance. Unwilling to recline for examination. Does not blink under bright lamplight. Pulse steady during whipping. The tone remains professional, even as the sentences reveal an undercurrent of fear. By late March, Freeman constructed what he calls the endurance trial. The procedure, as reconstructed from witness depositions, involved prolonged physical strain under observation. The overseers record that Sarah stood motionless for 8 hours without complaint. Freeman's commentary reads like a clinical marvel. The subject appears indifferent to discomfort. Perspiration is minimal, breathing measured. This degree of tolerance suggests an anomalous circulatory rhythm. Between these notes appear marginalia, phrases hastily scrawled, no sleep, unresponsive to pain, sang softly in unknown tongue. Each addition contradicts the previous attempt at order. Excerpt from Journal of Overseer Thomas B. April 6, 1847. Dr. Freeman insists she is not to be worked till further notice. He speaks of finding the limits of flesh. I saw the woman lift the broken yoke with ease. No blood, though the skin split open. Freeman said it was due to the thickness of the dermis. I say something inside her is wrong. Freeman's private notebooks, those submitted to the Medical Society, take on a more frantic tone by April's end. He writes of tissue resilience, abnormal cellular repair, and refusal of decay. His final notes on Sarah's physiology border on disbelief. The lesion inflicted with scalpel at 11:20 a.m. closed by dusk without intervention. To modern readers, the language reveals the dissonance of antebellum pseudoscience, an attempt to rationalize horror within the syntax of study. Freeman refers to specimens and observations, never victims. Extract, letter fragment. Unsigned, presumed to be from Freeman to his father, Colonel Hiram Freeman, dated May 1847. You have said she is God's punishment for our vanity. I tell you, she misunderstood God's design. If I can isolate the cause of her strength, Riverton may achieve immortality. After this point, the handwriting becomes erratic. Pages are torn, ink smeared. The last legible line of the Freeman Journal reads, "She no longer speaks. She waits." The surviving accounts of what came to be known as the Freeman experiment occupy an uneasy place in the historical record. Abolitionist tracts from the 1850s cite the case as one of the earliest written proofs of Southern medical barbarity, using it to expose how intellectual vanity and racial hierarchy converged under the guise of science. Yet the physical documents themselves, the letters, journals, and ledgers, speak in quieter tones, their horror embedded in the politeness of medical language. Dr. Horace Freeman's disappearance after June 1847 remains unresolved. The plantation's own ledger lists his journey to New Orleans as temporary, a notation suggesting routine travel, yet no arrival or correspondence was ever recorded. Some historians interpret this as deliberate erasure, others as consequence of the chaos that followed the Riverton disturbances. Among the oral traditions passed down through the descendants of Riverton's enslaved families, the story survives in another form. They speak of a tall woman who did not die, only vanished when the rains came. To them, she was not a victim nor an anomaly, but a reckoning, an embodiment of endurance beyond the reach of those who sought to measure and possess her. Viewed through this fragmented evidence, the Freeman experiment reveals the transformation of science into a ritual of control. Each page of Freeman's meticulous documentation mirrors the moral decay of the world that produced it, precise, orderly, and self-condemning through its own objectivity. The recurring motif of measurement becomes symbolic, an attempt to assert mastery over the inexplicable. What began as observation evolved into obsession, and in that descent, the lines between physician, overseer, and priest of cruelty dissolved entirely. Under the authority of the parish coroner, April 19, 1847, the examination of one Negro female, approximately 23 years of age, identified in plantation records as Sarah, was ordered to be conducted on premises following the incident recorded as the Night of Chains. The remains were delivered to the county infirmary at dawn, accompanied by 2 officers of the constabulary and the overseer of the plantation. The corpse was wrapped in burlap cloth soaked in water and soot, its lower limbs encircled by lengths of partially fused iron. The initial report notes difficulty in separating the iron from the body without damage to the surrounding tissues. The metal had cooled into the skin, producing what appeared to be complex, spiral-like burns. The iron itself was found to be brittle, showing crystalline fractures inconsistent with ordinary cooling. Observers remarked that the temperature retained by the iron exceeded that of its own source. Upon removal of the wrappings, the examining physician, Dr. W. W. Henley, described the condition as follows. The subject is of unusually tall stature, possessing muscular proportions beyond those commonly found among female field hands. Bone density is abnormal, particularly at the femur and humerus, where the marrow cavity appears constricted as though compressed from within. The muscle fibers display a curious fibrous luster, retaining partial rigidity even in death. The facial features show no contortion of pain, suggesting cessation was sudden.
Further inspection recorded contusions and healed fractures consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Scars along the scapulae and upper back were measured and catalogued, with notation that the spacing of certain marks suggested mechanical restraint or binding. A groove, deep and continuous, encircled both wrists, consistent with long-term confinement in shackles. The lower, abdomen revealed scar tissue suggesting both malnutrition and repeated impact injuries. At this stage, the coroner's assistant, Dr. Trumbull, requested measurement of cranial capacity in accordance with emerging racial classification studies then in practice. His notes, though incomplete, contain the following. Cranial volume exceeds index norms by nearly half-inch beyond the median African female category. Occipital bone pronounced. Mandibular formation is robust. Suggests an intermediate category between feminine and masculine constitution. A later marginal annotation in another hand, presumed to be Henley's, questions the relevance of this classification, remarking, "The attempt to assign a category misleads from observation. These are not signs of deviation, but endurance." The chest cavity was opened. A strong odor of burnt iron and fatty residue filled the chamber. Several attending witnesses recorded an audible hiss as air escaped from the rib cage, though no source of retained gas was determined. Within the thoracic cavity, the lungs were found desiccated beyond the expected degree for time of death, yet retaining a faint reddish hue. The heart was enlarged and misshapen. Notes describe a blackened streak running across the left ventricle, as if seared by contact with metal. Fragments of iron were recovered from beneath the clavicle and near the right shoulder. The metal was fused to the surrounding tissue. Under examination, these fragments showed traces of human calcium and organic carbon, implying partial absorption. No explanation is recorded. By the third hour of examination, observers noted minor movement in the musculature of the left arm. The phenomenon was attributed to post-mortem contraction, though one witness, a medical apprentice named Porter, later wrote in private correspondence, "The limb did not twitch, it drew inward, as if resisting us. I recall the air thickening, a copper taste, and a sound I cannot rightly name. The others pretended not to see." Dr. Henley terminated the procedure prematurely. His written justification cites risk of contamination and anomalous thermal residue. The remains were ordered to be interred at the edge of the plantation cemetery, marked as unfit for anatomical preservation. However, no burial record exists in county archives. The final recorded note states, "Specimen removed for further study under directive of Dr. Trumbull, Agricultural Research Office, Richmond." No follow-up report was filed. Subsequent documentation from the same month reveals that Trumbull began correspondence with a medical journal in Charleston under the title Preliminary Observations on Giant Negro Anomalies. Only fragments of his draft survive. Among them, one passage describes a female subject demonstrating resistance to metallurgical injury, musculature hardened through unnatural synthesis of heat and labor. Another notes, iron taken into the body becomes bone. The flesh no longer distinguishes. The Charleston Journal never published his work. Trumbull himself was found dead in his quarters by August of that year. Cause asphyxiation, presumed accidental. His body was discovered bound at the wrists with lengths of iron chain. An unsigned addendum appears attached to the coroner's original ledger sometime after 1850. The handwriting is faded but legible. The forge burned for 3 days after her death. The chains were not retrieved. Men say they hum when the air grows still. Be is not to disturb them. Decades later, a historian reviewing antebellum autopsy archives noted the absence of any official specimen from the Winton plantation incident, though inventory ledgers recorded one iron length measuring 6 feet, labeled residual sample, female subject, April 1847. Its current whereabouts remain unknown. The record closes with an annotation in red ink, probably added by a later clerk. Do not reopen. Refer any inquiry to Agricultural Archives. The matter is concluded.
It was not concluded. When the site was excavated in 1911, the iron was still there, half melted into the clay. Beneath it, fragments of bone fused to metal like veins of ore. The report lists no remains found intact, only residue. Thin, metallic, magnetic. Some said it hummed when struck. Others said it burned cold. And so the record ends, clinical, incomplete, resisting finality. The woman they called Sarah ceased to exist on paper that night, yet in every report her body refused to behave as a corpse should. The autopsy never finished because it could not be. By dawn, the plantation was gone, its foundation scorched to chalk, the earth sealed above her. The record begins with a letter, dated May 3rd, 1847, addressed to the parish sheriff's office, stamped and signed by A.C. Freeman, overseer of Winton Plantation. The document, preserved in carbon duplicate, bears the first and only official mention of what would later be called the incident of the forge. It reads, "Sir, it is my solemn duty to report that 6 white men, employed under my supervision, have perished by means of accident and subsequent combustion during the restraint of a female slave. The said woman, property of the estate, remains unaccounted for. Her name is listed in the ledger. Sarah, no surname. The cause of ignition remains uncertain. Immediate inspection required." The attached deposition repeats the same phrasing with minor clerical variations. The deaths are summarized as blunt and burning trauma, consistent with industrial malfunction. The term insurrection appears only in a margin note, written later in a different hand. The sheriff's summary, entered into the county ledger, contains a single additional line. Negro woman missing, status presumed destroyed. No description of the scene, no statement from witnesses, no mention of fire damage beyond the forge itself. When the inquest convened 4 days later, under the jurisdiction of the parish court, the proceedings were recorded by a clerk named Whitby, whose handwriting is erratic but legible. His minutes survive in fragments, salvaged from a later microfilm copy of case file number 2427, Freeman Estate Disturbance. The transcript begins. Chairman, Honorable Elias Vance. We proceed to determine cause and extent of property loss. Sheriff Rowe. The incident has resulted in the destruction of valuable machinery and human capital. Vance. Clarify, property or personnel? Rowe. Both, sir. The phrasing remains consistent throughout. Loss equated with damage to assets, lives measured in cost. No medical or moral inquiry is recorded, only valuation. Of the 12 witness statements noted, only 2 survive. 1 is unsigned, likely dictated to the clerk. She did not scream when the chains turned white. She moved fast, like they bent away from her. The men fell down, and the light swallowed them. The second is from a stable hand identified as Thomas, age 17. I saw her walk out the door. Nothing on her but smoke. Both statements are struck through in the margin, followed by the annotation, omit emotional. By June of that year, the case was officially closed. The final entry in the court docket reads simply, matter resolved. Damage to estate compensated by insurer. Remaining property redistributed. Sarah's name never reappears. For decades, the event lived only in scattered correspondence, letters between the Freeman family and local authorities requesting indemnity, lists of burned equipment, applications for replacement laborers. It was in one such letter, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives under Industrial Loss Claims, 1847 to 1849, that the term slave insurrection was added retrospectively. When the federal census of 1850 was compiled, Winton Plantation listed 0 deaths, 0 runaways. Yet in 1891, during the reorganization of the Louisiana State Archives, an archivist named Edwin C. Marston filed a routine report noting discrepancies in several antebellum case inventories. His notes, later transferred to microfilm, described the loss of case file 2427 In bureaucratic understatement, box contents missing, label detached. Probable misfiling during transfer from parish office to state repository.
However, an internal memo from the same month contradicts him. Written in a different tone, unsigned, it states, "Material withdrawn by special request, Department of Agricultural Records. No duplication permitted." Researchers revisiting the archives in the early 20th century discovered further inconsistencies. The physical logbook of 1847 depositions showed page numbers that skipped from 312 to 320. The missing folios were replaced with new paper, the ink newer, handwriting unfamiliar. The entry for Freeman estate now read, "Case expunged," record superseded by later index. The alteration was made using iron gall ink, manufactured after 1870. In 1934, during WPA cataloguing of antebellum documents, microfilm operators encountered a reel labelled Freeman Inquiry, partial damaged. The first frames contained only static, blurry pages, light leaks, and a faint outline of the sheriff's letter. Then nothing. The operator's notes describe repetitive patterns of heat bloom on the film, as if the material had been exposed to a high-intensity lamp for too long. In 1972, a graduate researcher named Helen R. Tully compiled a cross-reference index of missing antebellum inquests. Her report, filed under anomalous record voids, 1840 to 1855, lists the Freeman Inquiry as destroyed or withheld. A footnote adds, "Traces of original pagination suggest physical removal of contents post-1891. Paper fibers in binding correspond to late 19th century starch adhesives. Replacement sheets contain consistent watermark of U.S. Army Reconstruction Bureau." That watermark was used exclusively for correspondence related to Freedman's property claims. Its presence in an 1847 file is impossible. In 1989, a Louisiana archivist reopened the Winton collection to verify plantation ownership documents. The folder labeled F was intact but thin. Inside, a single sheet of parchment, folded twice, edges bro. Ittle. It bore the title Inventory of Damage, Winton Estate. The list included tools, livestock, a wagon, and a notation, 1, female, unreturned. Beneath it, in lighter ink, almost erased, foundry subject. Refer to military custody, 1865. The archivist who examined it noted a faint metallic stain along the fold. Rust-like, but non-ferrous. She sent a sample for analysis. The result came back inconclusive. High trace of iron and human calcium residue. The page was resealed and returned to storage. When the file was requested again in 1994, it was gone. The box label remained empty. The accession number had been reassigned to an unrelated ledger on livestock exports. Researchers tracing the disappearance of Sarah's record through the archives speak of a consistent pattern. Missing witnesses, altered ink, folded margins. Every bureaucratic layer preserved its own silence. A reconstruction of archive procedure from the 1890s describes how files were routinely reindexed during office transfers. Old case numbers were replaced with numerical codes, 42 to 7F in this instance, before microfilming. Once reclassified, the physical originals were destroyed, but in this case, the microfilm itself is missing the same pages. Under fluorescent light, the reels flicker. You can still see the faint outlines of erased names, the indentation where a pen pressed too hard, leaving ghosts in the cellulose. Sometimes, if the film slows, a shape appears for a single frame. White ash marks like fingerprints. Archivists learn to read what isn't there, the pattern of omission, the rhythm of absence. In Sarah's case, the silence is louder than any record. One internal memo from the Reconstruction Bureau, undated but stamped confidential, references the transfer of classified human specimen recovered from burned estate site. It bears no names, only coordinates. Those coordinates correspond to the old Winton property. Nothing else follows.
The inquiry that began as a question of property loss ended as a disappearance, of evidence, of witnesses, of a woman whose name was too volatile for paper. Each clerk, archivist, and historian who handled the file seems to have rewritten it slightly, sanding down its edges until nothing remained but categories and cross-references. By the time the last archivist filed her report, even the ash had an index number. And when the microfilm stops spinning, the reel continues to hum, faint and metallic, like something that remembers. The remaining evidence begins with a single brittle clipping. The Riverton Gazette, May 12, 1847. The masthead is partially torn. The paper thin to transparency. The headline reads, "Unfortunate calamity at Winton Estate. Property loss and injury reported." Beneath it, a column of text only 12 lines long. Reports reach us of a distressing accident on the property of the late Mr. Freeman, wherein a portion of the foundry was destroyed by fire, resulting in several fatalities. Local authorities assure the public that order has been restored and the matter fully contained. There is no cause for alarm among neighbouring estates. That is all. No names, no mention of Sarah. The rest of the issue contains standard news: cotton yields, steamboat arrivals, the price of molasses. At the bottom corner, an advertisement for Freeman Sons Machinery Replacements, forged chains, iron implements, guaranteed quality. Researchers who reviewed the Gazette archives in 1911 discovered that the next 3 issues, May 19th, May 26th, and June 2nd, were missing. Their absence was attributed to water damage from a flood in 1858, but no flood was recorded that year in Riverton Parish. In 1939, microfilm archivists cataloguing antebellum newspapers for the State Library noted irregular lacuna between the spring and summer editions of 1847. The gaps aligned precisely with the dates following the Winton incident. The newspaper's editor at the time, Thomas J. Breyer, left no surviving correspondence. His printing ledgers, however, remain intact. On May 11th, 1847, his account book records an unusually high purchase of ink, 4 times the regular amount, and then ceases entirely by the next week. What exists in his stead are blank pages numbered in sequence with the notation, "Reissue requested by Parish Board, pending approval." The approval never came. By the late 19th century, local retellings of the Riverton calamity had already transformed the event into rumour, the fire that spared the house but took the men. The Freeman family's descendants continued to hold influence in the parish council, donating to church expansions and funding the restoration of courthouse archives in 1878. It was during this restoration that most of the earlier court dockets, those from 1845 to 1849, were reportedly purged due to deterioration. Deterioration became an administrative synonym for deletion. An internal report from the State Archive Commission dated November 2, 1891, describes irrecoverable rot among stored newsprint and authorises selective preservation of high-value materials. The committee defined high value as documents pertinent to commerce, governance, and heritage. Slave records and industrial accidents were not considered heritage. When microfilm reproduction began in the 1920s, the gaps widened. Machines copied what was visible. Absences replicated themselves infinitely. By 1952, the Gazette reels held nothing between April and June 1847, an emptiness perfectly preserved, the film whirring through nothing, leaving behind the impression of light burned across cellulose. Researchers later discovered that a secondary archive existed, a private collection belonging to the Riverton Historical Society. Inside, bound in green cloth, were newspaper indexes compiled by volunteers in the 1880s. Each entry summarized a month's news. The May 1847 section included this line: "Accident at Winton Foundry, see front page." The notation is followed by a symbol, a small black cross inked beside the reference, unique among all entries. Below it, someone has written in pencil, much later, "Omitted from reprint, by order of the parish." No signature. Historians examining censorship practices of the Reconstruction South recognize this pattern. When violence threatened to stain lineage, documents were rewritten as natural disasters or worker mishaps. The logic was simple. Commerce must remain unsullied. Memory, when inconvenient, could be replaced by paperwork. The mechanism of forgetting operated in 3 stages. First, classification. The event was reduced to an industrial mishap. Second, absorption. The tragedy was folded into economic reports, iron prices, labor shortages. Third, evaporation. The incident ceased to exist as a line item and became a rumor, confined to private recollection. Even federal archival projects avoided revisiting it. A memo from 1935, written during the WPA Historical Survey, dismisses the Winton case as unsubstantiated by material evidence. The supervising historian added, "Local sentiment discourages further inquiry." In oral history, recordings made during the 1960s, an elderly reside, of Riverton Parish, identified only as M, described how her grandmother warned children not to mention the name Sarah aloud. "The white folks didn't burn her name," she said. "They buried it." That burial was bureaucratic. In 1978, a graduate student investigating lost Southern periodicals uncovered a file labeled Restricted, Industrial Archives, Riverton Division. Inside was a fragment of type from an old printing press, an S warped by heat, fused to its mold. The accompanying label read, "Recovered from Gazette Office Ruins, 1871 renovation." No other letters survived. A small thing, a letter pressed from lead, outlasting every word that once surrounded it. And so, all that remains of the printed world's account of Sarah is this: a paragraph too polite to say what happened, and a melted initial that once began her name. The rest, the shape of what occurred, the echo of its consequence, moved beyond ink and paper. It survived in hymns, whispers, and the slow inheritance of memory passed from mouth to mouth. When the archives went silent, the songs began. They carried what the ledgers could not. And so, the chronicle turns away from the written and returns to the spoken, the human record. The interviewer, whose name withheld in the surviving carbon copy, records that most of the informants refused to speak on record. They referred to her indirectly, in lowered voices, as if the name itself remained charged. In the margins a note reads, "Subject presumed mythic. Testimony retained for linguistic interest only." Yet the fragments persist, recurring with subtle consistency across parishes. One woman, age estimated at 93, recalled a tall gal, all iron, walking slow into the water. The tape transcript notes the sound of her cane tapping against the floorboards. She would not say where it happened, only that her grandmother seen the sparks off the chain when the moon hit. In another account, a man from Pointe Coupé parish described a story told to him as a child. "She went where they couldn't follow, into the muck. You hear the links, you don't turn around." The collector appended a bracketed observation. Speaker's eyes watering. Pauses frequently. Refuses further detail. The report describes the atmosphere of the interviews. The air dense with humidity, cicadas audible through open shutters, the smell of iron and bay water seeping through the walls. Each testimony was delivered reluctantly, as though recounting a personal debt. None of the participants claimed direct kinship, yet all traced the narrative to a forebear who had worked the Freeman land. Their genealogies intersect across decades of census records, though the official documentation remains inconsistent. Birth years misaligned, surnames altered after emancipation, household numbers missing. One folder labeled Negro Folklore, My Eski, contains phonetic transcriptions of chants sung by cane field laborers during harvest. The refrain appears multiple times. She bent chain, chain bent her. The archivist's note in pencil, possible reference to labor songs, female figure of strength, Vieux-Tunctes. Erify origin. No verification followed. The WPA supervisor's correspondence shows discomfort with the material. In an internal memo dated September 4, 1937, he writes, "Local staff preoccupied with occult Negro legends. Please redirect attention to productive folklore, e.g. foodways ballads." The request was acknowledged but never enforced. Subsequent entries continue under disguised titles: Work Hymns, Cane River Stories, On Women of Strength. The name Iron Woman disappears entirely after that date. Later cross-referencing of field notes reveals a distinct pattern. Interviews mentioning the chain-bearing figure correlate with areas of former Freeman holdings, now under federal reclamation. The surveyors note an unusual reluctance among white residents to participate, many claiming no colored uprisings ever occurred here. Some of those same properties contain unregistered burial mounds, documented in soil maps, but omitted from parish records. The writing of the anthropologist grows more clinical toward the end. He catalogues the cadence, not the meaning, recording accent stress, vowel elongation, hesitation length. "My duty," he notes, "is phonetic, not moral." But between the lines, the tone betrays unease. He compares multiple testimonies: the height of the woman, the heat of the chains, the silence after her disappearance. Each retelling folds into the next, as though time itself conspires to erase the edges. By the end of the survey, the file contains nothing definitive, only traces, burnt paper scent, misaligned ink ribbons, faint pencil marks of redaction. Yet across the testimonies runs an unbroken thread: a figure that refused burial, a body that would not yield to record or soil. The report closes with an annotation added years later by an unnamed archivist: "Material retained for possible anthropological interest, context uncertain, subject believed to refer to a folk entity associated with resistance myths." Initial entry filed by the Louisiana State University Department of Anthropology. Site designation RVT 04. Coordinates correspond to the derelict grounds of the former Freeman Forge, identified through 1840 survey maps. Excavation initiated under state contract for proposed agricultural drainage channeling. Field crew unearthed iron fragments at depth of 1.7 meters. Subsequent brush removal revealed skeletal material partially encased in oxidized residue. The configuration was irregular: radius and ulna fused to metal curvature, vertebrae exhibiting compression fractures consistent with blunt restraint, femur intact. Sample photographs, since misplaced, were described in notes as bone white against red clay. The attending technician, R. Delane, noted abnormal iron bloom patterns, links distorted from interior stress points rather than exterior force. Microscopy at Baton Rouge Laboratory confirmed that the deformation occurred under extreme localized pressure, estimated above manual capacity. The official summary, understated: possible metallurgical warping via thermal or chemical exposure. No such exposure source was present at the layer's depth. Further analysis dated the remains to approximately 1845 to 1850, within margin of error consistent with plantation operational years. Isotopic reading of tooth enamel suggested mixed ancestry, West African maternal markers. A supplementary memo by the consulting biologist suggested the remains belonged to a female individual, height approximately 6 feet 1 in, unusually dense cortical bone structure. This phrasing reappears in subsequent correspondences, but is later replaced by the word specimen. By week 3, excavation was halted under jurisdictional uncertainty. A telegram from Riverton County Sheriff's Office ordered all materials transferred to Baton Rouge for custody pending identification. No record confirms their R's. Rival. Inventory sheets list chain fragments, 6 units, and skeletal components, partial. A red stamp marks the final line. Archive closed, 1973. Local witnesses recall that the site flooded soon after, the redirected canal overrunning the trench. A newspaper clipping from the Riverton Gazette mentions unusual findings at Freeman property. State denies rumor of slave remains. No photographs accompany the article,
The journalist's byline is absent. An internal university memo, obtained through Open Records Request, 1981, notes faculty pressure to distance the department from politically charged folklore. The term Iron Woman appears handwritten in the margin, followed by a single question mark. A curator later admitted under interview that certain materials, specifically chain fragments, were never catalogued. They were heavy, and no one wanted responsibility. A postscript within the file bears the signature of a graduate student, initialed only TM. The outward bend cannot be natural. It implies expansion, resistance. I recommend further analysis. The suggestion was never acted upon. The final entry in the log, typed faintly and misaligned, reads, Artifacts of uncertain cultural value. Disposal authorized following contamination report. July 14, 1974. No contamination record exists. In local memory, the field where the forge once stood remains uncultivated. Vegetation refuses uniform growth. Excavation markers are gone, but fragments occasionally surface after heavy rain, slender arcs of rust shaped like broken halos. No museum lists their provenance. When later researchers attempt to trace the missing crate through shipping manifests, they find an empty record number reused for unrelated materials, a set of 19th-century manacles from an unknown penitentiary. Both entries share the same accession code. The coincidence is unacknowledged. The report concluded, "It's without conclusion. Evidence found, evidence lost, chain unbroken." The Freeman site is silent now. The fields that once fed on ash grow uneven, their furrows broken by roots and rusted debris. Each spring, new soil covers the past like bureaucracy, neat rows concealing something that will not stay buried. Recent surveys identify faint soil discoloration near the old forge's foundation, circular patches where the ground resists water. Chemical analysis suggests oxidized iron saturation. Beneath one such patch, ground-penetrating radar records an anomaly. Irregular mass, non-geological. No excavation is authorized. In nearby church registers, the year 1847 ends abruptly. A ledger line reads, 6 interred, unnamed. Then a gap, pages torn, numbers skipping sequence. The handwriting resumes weeks later, steadier, neater, as though the interruption had been corrected into silence. The parish priest's annotations mention a disturbance among the Negro quarters and corresponding loss of property. Not a single name. Across generations, the story persisted without ink. In a 1939 recording preserved by the WPA, an elderly woman hums a melody, uneven, almost whispered. She says her grandmother called it the chain song. No lyrics remain, only the rhythm of breath where words once were. The transcription file lists the tune as fragmented spiritual, source unknown. When historians later rediscovered Freeman correspondence, the contrast was unmistakable. Every scientific phrase, specimen, endurance, property, reads like ritual, an attempt to quantify what resisted being measured. Sarah's defiance, recorded through omission, endures not through her name, but through what could not be written. She became the margin's refusal, the space left blank where ownership was meant to be. Modern researchers describe the case as inconclusive. Yet the evidence, bent iron, erased ledgers, oral echoes, forms a geometry of resistance. What science classified as anomaly was simply life-refusing submission. In the long machinery of documentation, Sarah Freeman ceased being a person. She became the malfunction that the archive could not repair. At dusk, the field falls quiet. Wind moves through the reeds, and for a moment the shape of the past seems audible, the slow rhythm of chains striking against one another, then dissolving into the sound of crickets. The recorder clicks off, data saved, silence restored. But even now, silence is not absent. It is design, history built to forget. What survives is not her record, but her interruption. She is the break in continuity, the echo where authority ends.
Her name remains unspoken in ledgers, but it endures in the songs. Nearly 2 centuries later, the ledgers still lie, and yet her absence speaks louder than ink. Sarah Freeman's story was never meant to survive, but it endures, in soil, in song, in the quiet refusal of history to forget her completely. The chains that once confined her became the symbol that outlived her captors. If her story moved you, share this chronicle, so her silence travels farther than the men who tried to contain it. Subscribe to Forgotten Chronicles for more unearthed histories, the ones they tried to erase and the ones still waiting beneath the dust.